Welcome to Spotlight Sessions, where we shine a
What's
light
your
on
story?
incredible. What does accessibility mean to you?
What's your mission? Welcome all to accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions, where we shine a light on incredible individuals and organizations and the work that they do. I'm your host, Josh Basil. I'm a C4-5 quadriplegic paralyzed below my shoulders and a power wheelchair user. I'm the community relations manager at accessiBe and a passionate disability rights advocate and trial attorney focused on breaking down barriers to access and inclusion for people with disabilities. Today on accessiBe Spotlight Sessions, we're joined by Dr. JohnRoss Rizzo, the Health Systems Director of Disability Inclusion at NYU Langone Health. Welcome, JR.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, Josh.
Excited to have you. And so, JR, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I'm principally trained as a disability medicine doctor, um, but I spend most of my time doing science and oversee a large research portfolio that's broadly tackling access barriers for persons with disabilities across the board. But I also happen to be a disability doctor with a disability, and I was born with a retinal dystrophy called choroideremia. And I've been legally blind for about 25 years or so. So that's really helped shape my career journey, and what I spend most of my time doing these days, which I'm looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you for sharing that. And then tell us a little bit more with NYU Health Systems and what the work that you're doing and how you got involved.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Happy to do that. So I sort of spread my time out in sort of three different work streams. The first is as a physician scientist, and so we oversee some large federal projects that are tackling, as I mentioned in the beginning, access barriers. But specifically, we're developing new assistive technologies, and many of them initially are spearheading support for persons who are blind and low vision. So we do a lot of work in the macro and micro navigation space. We do a lot of work in trying to develop more full access trip support, including first mile, middle mile, and last mile. And I can expound on that if of interest. And we do a lot of additional work within device design. We've created some unique advanced wearables that get into the world of haptics, and so we've created some really neat haptic interfaces. So that's perception through touch, and you could think of some of our work as instrumented backpacks. So body-based wearables that have miniaturized camera systems that are constantly surveying the environment, extracting 3D environmental details, and then feeding back processed information to the end user, human in a loop. And also, we're now working on clinician in a loop so we can better help support you. Um, the goal is to really provide a platform that can then host a series of software modules or microservices that can do, again, things like wayfinding and navigation support, sign recognition, potentially help you, cross the street with pedestrian signal detection, in addition to crosswalk negotiation, basic obstacle negotiation, and the list goes on and on. And so that's sort of one area. The other workflow or work stream has to do with my work as a departmental leader. And so I help oversee two divisions in our disability medicine department. One is our innovation and technology division, which I'm really excited about. We're revising our global digital strategy, which has been a whole lot of fun, and I'm happy to talk more about that. And then the other one is our diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility division. And we focus a lot on that last A, of course. And then that last work stream is something I'm extremely excited about, and potentially we could talk more about in our conversation today. And that has to do with NYU taking a firm step explicitly into the disability inclusion space, which we do not see happening a lot in the academic medical center arena. And so we worked on developing some pro formas with our executive leadership group. And about a year ago, we launched a new office. And I'm happy to serve as the inaugural director for that health systems office. And we're doing all sorts of cool stuff. I mean, we're creating new inclusive patient waiting rooms. We're coming up with better standards for digital accessibility and trying to upskill a number of our teams. We're trying to create new ambassador models. We're working on better procurement policies when we onboard new vendors and supply chain, and holding, potentially our new partners and collaborators more accountable as it relates to accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. So we could go on, and we're developing and revising a strategic roadmap, but it's been a lot of fun, and I know the best is yet to come.
I feel like I could listen to you all day long talk about this awesomeness. This is, you get to play, you get to build, you get to create, change the landscape and the disability narrative within NYU Health. That's amazing. I love what you're doing.
I
And
appreciate that.
and what a how is Rizzo Lab and created, or what motivated you and your team to like do Rizzo Lab, and what's of all the great stuff that you're talking about, what's kind of housed right there?
Yeah, sure. So, I in medical school, this is going back over about 20 years ago. Um, as my vision continued to deteriorate, I started looking into assistive technology, and I said, I need more support. I need better tools. And when I looked around, I was sort of shocked by the lack of commercially available tools. And when we think about it, and obviously much of this work is overdue, and we should do more of it. But I mean, even an example like a power wheelchair and having different manufacturers and different options, or if we look within the prosthetic space and powered prostheses, and having different competitors. When we get into sort of bread and butter assistive technology for someone who's blind and low vision, we don't really have go-to solutions. I mean, we have the white cane and the guide dog, and those are great. They're certainly primary mobility tools. I mean, the guide dog is really an animate tool, right? And sometimes a barking one too. But there's so much more we can do. I mean, we're in the middle of this fourth industrial revolution, and having these supplemental or secondary aids, there's so much additional value we can provide. And I know it's a hard space. It's a space that has been sort of filled with ups and downs. But I wholeheartedly believe that with the partnership of the federal government, with a lot of our strength in politicians, and government agencies, and other academicians, we can put our heads together to come up with more options to build that armamentarium. And so this was really motivated out of my sort of frustration and angst. I said, I mean, here I am, I'm tripping more, I'm falling more, I have dented shins, and, what am I going to use? And I didn't really have clear choices. And so I said, I could continue to sulk about it, or I could help participate in moving the field forward. And I know we're sort of one straw, one cog in a huge, huge wheel, but I do feel like we've had some defined contributions. And again, I know we're just getting started, but really excited on the foundation we've laid over the last 15 years or so, and really excited for what the future is going to hold. Um, I really do believe we could talk more about this later, but I think the next 5 years are going to be so transformational in the assistive technology space for a couple of reasons, and we can talk more about that at the end of our chat if we have time.
But there's just so many things that you're doing to, like you said earlier, about creating better options, creating options, letting the user decide what works for them, or how they want to use it within a unique setting. Like
Mhm.
it's incredible to be able to give kind of those powers, those abilities to people that are waiting for technology to advance to give them a different way of doing things creatively and within their own unique world. And I would love to know, do you have a memorable moment or story that within the NYU health system that's had a lasting impact on you?
So many moments. I mean, I have to tell you, sometimes days are long, and they can be hard. Um, I have to be a bit mindful on the patient side of the equation, given privacy, but I will share a student story, um, that I think will stay with me as long as I have breath in my lungs. Um, so I was called by a colleague of mine who also happens to be blind, and also happens to be a physician. And he said, JR, I had this amazing woman in my office. Um, she's on a small tour of the United States, and you have to meet with her. And I said, okay, I mean, if you say so, your words are golden from your lips to my ears, no problem. So he said, but she's only in town for another like 24 hours, so you have to make it fast. And I'm like, oh, geez. So we had a crazy schedule. I don't know. I was reviewing grants and we had a deadline and blah, blah. So I said, okay, have her meet me tomorrow during this time. And we exchanged contact information. So um, anyway, long story short, um, we're at our meeting time the next day, and a half hour goes by, an hour goes by, an hour and a half goes by, nothing. And so I thought, maybe this student had to go back early, whatever. I didn't really think anything of it. So 2 hours later, the student shows up, and she was incredibly apologetic. And she also happened to be blind, and she also had a very significant hearing impairment. And she shared with me how it was very harrowing for her to get to the actual health system. And she had tried to call, but I think messed up one digit in my phone number. So she couldn't get a hold of me. And so she was struggling for like the last 2.5 hours to get to my office. But the persistence and the tenacity of the student to end up getting finally to the destination from someone who had never been to New York City, had never been to our health system, had never been within the ambulatory building that I was in, and she ended up getting to my lab ultimately about 2.5 hours late. She hadn't had anything to eat that day, hadn't had a beverage, hadn't do. So we had her sit down. We wanted her to sort of tell us her story, and it turns out that this one student, again, I don't want to share too many details, but was currently in graduate school in another country, and was experiencing some barriers. Initially, she thought those barriers um, were going to be dealt with, and then as time went on, unfortunately, more barriers mounted. Um, and her journey in that day in of itself was so remarkable to me, and then the decision that she made to then meet other sort of leaders or academicians in another country and to sort of go on this tour was so remarkable. And uh, I'm happy to report that we are still good friends and colleagues, and that she is still involved in and completing graduate school, and that we've kept a very strong alliance, and that will sort of remain emblazoned in my memory, both speaking to sort of tenacity, but also the sort of the journey, or the journey traveled, or the distance traveled, right? Um,
Absolutely. My when I was first paralyzed below my shoulders, a wave picked me up, dropped me on my head, and shattered my neck. And I remember my mom had a stone, a Winston Churchill quote: "Never, never, never give up."
mhm.
And it's just like the perseverance of being able to keep pushing, keep pushing. You might not be able to get to your destination right on time, but you know you can make it there. And maybe she decided that day to not make it there, and then that would have maybe not, she would not be a colleague of yours today.
Yeah.
So it's the fact is she did. And no, I love that story. And
Yep. Yep.
thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah, no, of
but
course. I mean, I have more details. I mean, the fact that she took two city buses, the subway system. I mean, personally, as someone who's visually impaired, I only go on the subway with another person, out of fear, and I know New York City and I know the subway system. But yeah, it was, truly an incredible feat. But she did, as you rightfully mentioned, got to her destination.
and
So.
what first comes to mind when you hear the word accessibility?
It's interesting, and I hear accessibility defined in so many ways, and I love that you asked this question. For me, it means that everything works for everybody, and I think that's what's most important. I mean, people talk about hardware and software and different populations, but at the end of the day, if we're really talking about universal design, we want everything to work for everybody. And I don't care where you come from, what your background is. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it should be universal, and that sort of that work factor should be ubiquitous, and I think that's what really um, uh, strikes or resonates most with me. Um,
And what role do you think technology places in making the world more inclusive for people with disabilities?
I think it plays a really important role. I mean, I've met so many persons with disabilities over my life, and in my mind, they're all different forms of superheroes. You end up sort of developing and honing these strengths over time, and it's really incredible um, to see or hear in certain instances how people have overcome, incredible adversity to get there, to their final destination or final target. Um, so I think that's what's most important for me in thinking about that. Yeah.
And if everyone could do one thing or a bit more to make the world more inclusive, what could that be? Just the general public, what could they do more?
Yeah, I would say there are two things that I think are really critical. The first would be a little more education. I think reading a bit more on the disability rights movement. Um, hearing a little bit more. I mean, even reading about what FDR did um, with his sort of battles earlier on. And how he set into motion, I think, a lot of the future change that we see in this country. um, there's also some sort of bad news and bad stories, and hearing about ableism and reading about the ugly laws, for example, that existed in the United States up until the mid 1970s, which are really a terrible blemish on our history, I think is important, and sort of understanding that backdrop. And then the other thing I think is being very intentional about how we all move forward as potential leaders, and wanting to work collaboratively with persons with disabilities, and to learn more about disability etiquette, and about what's needed, and about how to be more open to change and to be anti-ableist. And I think if we can sort of juxtapose a little bit of that education with some of that sort of intentional leadership, um, and start slow and then build up some momentum. But I think the world would be a much better place.
I can't agree with you more. The ability to learn, to be more aware of what you don't know, and then to have the right conversations, it can go a long way. And then when it comes to like, what do you wish like brands in the business world did more of to prioritize kind of accessibility and inclusion?
Um, I think the number one um, tip that I would give um, brands and institutions or enterprises across the board would be to make the investment in disability inclusion. I think a lot of times people are very reticent to make the investment. They think they're going to be these sort of snowballing, exorbitant costs, and it's going to be a never-ending prophecy. And they don't really understand the ROI that's baked into, those opportunities. Um, I think at the end of the day, um, when we look at disability inclusion, and we characterize the value that persons with disabilities bring to enterprises, there's all sorts of ingenuity, deductive reasoning, innovation. But even if you get into the marketing and brand space, it's hugely valuable. And the one that I think is not often discussed or not is the financial ROI. I mean, I think when we really create the appropriate lanes, where the lanes are accessible and have the accommodations, we really find that there's incredible value. And there have been reports from Accenture and otherwise that sometimes a person with a disability will be sort of a 2xer. They're going to provide twice as much value. It's just about trying to put a simple accommodation in place that the data really shows are not very expensive across the board. It's just more of that sort of fear and a lack of understanding that I think really holds us back. And if I may, I wanted to um, I sort of jumped into two answers to your question before, but you asked about the role of technology and what it plays. And I started off by saying I think all persons with disabilities are really superheroes in different ways because of all the challenges that they faced over their lives. But we don't all have the same tools, right? We don't have the Gatling guns, we don't have the sonar systems, and I think in order to make a largely inaccessible world more equitable, I think it's really important to be technology adopters and to push change as it relates to technology. And I think that's really really critical. So making sure that Batman has all of the appropriate tools is really critical, so he can keep Gotham safe, right? And I think it's really important that we establish a narrative where technology is really critical. I mean, if we think about a modern civilization, I mean, we would be lost right now without our mobile phones. I mean, we live in an industrialized society that's incredibly dependent on automobiles right now, technology, right? And even if we look at the crash data from vehicles, and in fact, the changes in legislation that have been made secondary to technology, technology has saved tens of thousands of lives and helped reduce crashes by orders of magnitude, and that's really important. And we think about this on sort of a technological basis, but we don't often apply it to the sort of human form factor, right? So why does it not? When we think of semi-autonomous vehicles or enhanced autopilot, all these other features, we think about it at this sort of automobile level, but why not at the person level, right? And I think that's all starting to change, but I think we need more of it. So I'm too excited to talk to you, Josh, so I'm jumping in between my answers here, but I wanted to
JR,
make sure that I elaborated on that.
you've got so much wisdom to share, and I can't thank you enough for sharing it. All that you do, all that you continue to do. Thank you for being our guest today on accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions. This was a lot to take in, and you explained it so well. And I just keep doing what you're doing. You're awesome.
I appreciate that, Josh. Thank you so much for what you're doing for the field, and really happy to hear from any of the viewers or listeners. So feel free to reach out at our NYU contact information, or check us out on the rizzolab.org website, and reach out and come say hi.
I'm excited for people to do just that, and for all of our guests, thank you so much for staying to the end of accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions. We make sure to hit that subscribe button and to follow us at accessiBe_community. And as always, thank you so much for being on this journey with us. Bye, everyone.